Let's now discuss case number 1 for object equality, namely, the equals method is simply inherited from the object class without being explicitly overridden. Let's consider one simple example. Let's say we have a class called point v1, standing for version number 1. We're going to have a point v2 later as well, so just notice the conventional for the notation I'm naming. So we got two private attributes, integer x and integer y. You have seen this example class actually in the earlier review lecture already. So let's simply use some familiar example that you have seen. Let's say we only got two attributes, and then we have one overloaded constructor point v1, and then which will simply initialize the x and y accordingly. Okay, that's it. That's about the entire definition for the class point v1. You can see we don't have any explicitly overridden equals method. So that means whenever we want to compare objects of type point v1 by using the equals method rather than equals equals, I'm talking about the equals method, it is going to invoke the default versions inherited from the object class. Let's now see both on the paper and also on Eclipse. Let's see both. Okay, let me first of all remind you about the diagram that we spoke about in the earlier part. We have the object class on the top. That's simply the parent class for every class that you include in your projects. So, for example, point v1. So this is the class we're talking about. Point v1, you can see extends from objects, what inherits from. We'll speak about the keyword extends later when we speak about the inheritance. But for now, you can see for the entire definition for point v1, we did not explicitly redefine or override the equals method. So that means this entire definition is going to be inherited. So that's really important for you to recall. Okay, so you can see this particular definition over here is going to be inherited verbatim into its subclass over here, right? That's something we spoke about in the earlier video. Inherited, meaning that it's going to be available for invocation. All right, so let's now talk about some code fragment to really for you to see the how the default version will work. Let's now go over line by line. The first line. So we are creating a string objects, string literal to be more precise, but at the runtime it's going to be a string objects. So the string value is 23, okay? And the value is going to be stored in variable s. Okay, so you can think about s stores the address of this particular string objects over here. Let's put it like that. You can think if you really want to visualize precisely, string is a reference type, and every string object has a value attributes, for example over here, and then that one there is more like an array character. Okay, but for convenience, I'm just going to put a string literal as a just for illustration purpose. Okay, it's going to be 2 and then 3. If you really want to visualize it precisely, it's going to be an array of size 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Index 0, index 1, index 2, 3, and 4 for different characters. If you really want to, feel free to do that. All right, so that's about the first line. And then for the next few lines, we're going to also visualize the creation of 3 point v1 objects. So we got p1, we got p2, and also we got p3, right? Each one of them is going to have different values for x and y over here. Okay, so I already drew the objects over here, p1, p2, and also p3. And of course, they're different objects. The first one, p1, is going to be 2, 3. And the second object is also going to be 2, 3, that p2 points to. And the third one is going to be 4, 6. All right, that's something very basic. I'm hoping that you're feeling comfortable about tracing them. Let's now try to execute the console application, right? You can also see on the Eclipse the project I made available to you. I'll switch to Eclipse in just a moment. Let's do the simple comparison first. What if we want to do p1 equals p2? That one's easy. We're simply trying to decide whether p1 and p2 are they pointing to the same objects over here. Apparently they're different, so that should be false. What about p2 equals p3? p2 equals p3. Similarly, p2 and p3, they're also pointing to different objects over here, right? So the first two are pretty straightforward, just as a warm-up, right? So you will see the printout should be false and false. Okay, awesome. What about the next one? What if we say P1 dot equals P1? Intuitively, it should be true because 1 should be equal to itself. It's something called reflexivity for the equals method, which is something I will go over about the principle for your design for the equals method. But for now, we want to know exactly how this can be traced. Let me now try to do this. If I say P1 dot equals P1, which one is the context objects? Apparently, this is the context object, right? Agree. So this will be the context objects. And the P1 over here will be the arguments. Okay, and if we want to trace it, we said that this version that's inherited from the object class is going to be invoked. So let's now trace it like how we did it before. So this is going to be replaced by P1. And then arguments object over here is also going to be replaced by P1 over here. So it really boils down into P1 equals P1. Does P1 point to the same object as P1 does? Apparently, yes. So that's why it's going to be true. All right, that's exactly how you trace it. Okay. Okay, that's going to be true. And there's one more thing I would like to show to you before I move on with the paper tracing. Let me now switch to Eclipse to see how we can use the debugger to find out exactly which version of the equals method is being invoked. That's really the critical thing for you to know. Let me now switch to Eclipse, and if you open up the project that's available for this week, so that will be example equality points persons, right? That's the project name. And if you open up the package called points over here, and let's go to point tester, and we also got point P1 and P2. And P1 is the current version we are talking about. You can take a look, right? That's the one without the explicit redefinition or overriding for the equals method that we just went through. Okay, so let's now go to point tester over here, right? So here, it's not exactly the same as what you saw on the paper on the iPad, but you will definitely get an idea. So what I want to show you is, if I try to do, for example, P1 dot equals P2 over here, right? You can see P1 and P2, especially P1. P1 is the context objects. The context object will decide which version of the equals method that's going to be called, right? Especially P1 was declared to be point V1. And we know that for point V1, that one will simply just inherits, that one simply will just inherits the version of equals from the object class, right? Let's just keep that in mind. So what I want to trace now is P1 dot equals P2 on Eclipse, just to show you. Okay, all the earlier pointed out, for example, P1 equals P2, that's something we already spoke about. And let me put a breakpoint at line number 18 in my case, but it should be the case for you as well. Okay, line number 18, right before we execute the line for P1 dot equals P2. Okay, that's something we want to see. We want to step into this method execution to see which version of the equals method is going to be invoked, just for you, just to make sure you can reproduce it and understand it completely. All right, so let's now go on to the debug button here. So that'll be debug point tester. Let's click on that, and we'll switch to debug perspective. All right, notice something I already set up for you on the debugger. You can see we got P1 and also P2. P1 is the context objects over here. P1 is the context objects. And also P2 is the arguments. So there's something I want you to pay attention to and remember for me. I'll try to remember together with you. What's the address for P1? If you look at P1, it's actually this particular address over here. We haven't defined like an overridden the toString method. That's why you can show this address over here. However, for our convenience, let's remember just the ID. Okay, the ID for the context object P1 is 15. Okay, remember that please. And also for P2, the ID is simply 16. Okay, so P1 context object has ID 15. P2 the argument has ID 16. They are unique, right? Because they're different objects. Okay, so now as soon as I say step into, what's going to happen is we're going to switch to the context of. Remember, we're going to invoke, in this case, this version of the equals method from the object class. So number one, we're going to switch into the class for objects, and number two, we're going to see this right now is going to be of ID 15, and then obj is going to be of ID 16, right? Just to correspond to the P1 and P2, right? That's something I want you to remember. Let's go back to Eclipse over here, and if I say step into, you can see now indeed we are in the object class context over here, the library class objects. and then we got this default version of the Boolean equals method over here, and then it will simply say this equals obj. And let's now see what the ID is. For this, it should be corresponding to the ID for P1, which we said should be 15. And for obj over here, the arguments over here, it should be corresponding to the ID for P2, which is 16. All right, let's double check. So if you try this over here, let's just go back to variables. If you say this, you can see ID is 15. And for arguments over here, obj is simply the argument 0, but that's basically obj, and that's actually 16, right? So that's really corresponding to what we have just illustrated. All right, and then are they the same objects by addresses? The answer is no. So that's why it's going to be false. So if you say step over and then step over, it's going to tell you that it's false, right? So the main point, again, the reason that I wanted to show you this for P1 that equals P2, number one, as soon as we try to step into the equals execution, it's going to switch the context into the object class, number one. And then number two, once we switch the context in there, it's going to be the default version of the equals method. And number three, you should really know how to visualize the this and also obj, which will correspond to the context object P1 and also the argument P2. But the third part is kind of corresponding to what we visualized before about tracing in the review part. All right, so that's about what I want to show to you over here, and you can look at the rest of the code yourself on the project, right? You can play with it and make some changes. Okay, so that's about what I want to show you on the Eclipse. Let's now finish the rest of the paper tracing quickly. What about the second one over here? What if we try to say P1 dot equals null over here, right? So the context object will be P1, right? So that's the context objects. And the null over here is going to be the arguments. So we're calling the same method over here the second time. And this equals obj is going to become P1 equals null. Is P1 pointing to null? Apparently not. P1 indeed is pointing to some objects. Apparently it is not null. So this should be false. Okay, let's now go on with the next one. The next one is also interesting. What if we say P1 dot equals S? And remember, S is the string object that we created at the first line over here. So context object is P1, and the argument is S over here. So boil down into P1 equals S over here. Are they pointing to the same objects? You can see P1 is pointing to point V1 objects. S is pointing to a string objects over here. Apparently, even the object type, you can see the title of the box, they are different. So there's no way they can be equal. Right? So it's going to be just false because they're pointing to different objects, to say the least. However, I would like to point out one thing over here that's really important. Okay? Let me just put a line over here. Let me just say here. Okay? First of all, it will boils down into the following expression. It's going to be P1 equals S according to the default version of the equals method. Okay? This is okay because the equals method, as I will try to explain a little bit later, the type of the arguments over here is simply just objects, meaning that any objects is going to be okay, including object maybe of different type as the context objects. You can see we got context object P1 point V1, but the argument S over here is actually string. It's actually it will actually compile. However, there's something I want to emphasize to you. Writing this directly is going to result in a compilation error. Writing this directly is going to mean that you got compilation error. Okay, it's really important to realize. However, if you simply try to invoke P1 that equals S, under the hood, it is going to compare P1 against S using relational operator. It is okay. It will just be done implicitly. However, you cannot explicitly write P1 equals S as a relational expression in your code directly. Okay, so these are two things you want to distinguish between. If you have any doubts, try to write this in your Eclipse, you already got a project, you can simply write P1 equals S. You will definitely get some compilation error. Okay, next one. Let's see the next one. Let me use maybe pink over here. What if I say P1 equals P2? Oh, sorry. P1 dot equals P2, which is what we did in the Eclipse. So if I say P1 context objects and P2 over here, so that means P1 equals P2, right? So P1 equals P2 is going to be true or false? P1 equals P2? Apparently not, because they're pointing to different objects. So it also is going to be false. Finally, let's see. Finally, red. P2 dot equals P3 over here. So that means it's going to be, let me put it here. So it's going to be P2 will be replacing this, and also P3 will be replacing objects. P2 equals P3. What should that be? P2 equals P3, and apparently they're different objects. Again, it's going to be false. So for case number 1, where we try to where we end up invoking the default version of the object class equals method, turns out to be quite straightforward, because it will only just boil down into checking the reference equality between the two reference variables. You will just have to make sure you know which one is the context object and which one is the arguments, right? You're just going to see which one is context objects and which one is the arguments. It's so important for you to see, right? Let me make a final notes, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next example. Let me just put how about this one here? So it should really be so clear that this part over here, this is the context objects. On the other hand, this part over here, inside the parentheses, when you invoke the method, this one over here is the arguments. The context object will be used to instantiate the this over here, and the arguments over here will be used to instantiate the obj over here. All right, so that's about the first version. Review it if you got any doubts. Otherwise, let's now see the second version, where the default equals method is actually overridden.